All right, welcome back to the Jaunty Mantis. This is a podcast about creative questions for curious gamers concerning TTRPGs and other nerd garbage. I am Matty, and here is my co-host Jesse. Jesse, how you been?
I'm doing pretty great. How about yourself?
Doing fantastic. What is our question for today, Jesse?
So the question that I was thinking about kind of kicking around in my head is we talk a whole lot about fantasy role-playing games.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk a fair amount about sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
What other genres of story are there in the role-playing game space? And what interests you about them?
Okay. So with D&D being the staple, kind of the generic template for role-playing games, do people even realize that they can play horror games or science fiction games or romance games? Like, what kind of genres are we talking about? Like, because it's like that Mitch Hedberg joke is kind of how I look at this, where he says, every book is a children's book if the kid can read, right? So any genre of game exists as long as you just want to play it. Like, you could play the 5e D&D rule set in any genre, in any type of game. What really makes these games different from each other? Like, what makes a science fiction game different from a fantasy game?
Plausible explanation for how the magic works.
You're going to have to do better than that.
No, I refuse.
Like, what is a science fiction game?
Yeah, that's science fiction game. I think I lean into space opera when I think of science fiction, which is not, to be honest, all that different.
What about Spelljammer?
Yeah, I don't think Spelljammer is not a science fiction game because it's not interested in the science at all.
Okay. Can you give me an example of a role-playing game that is interested in the science?
Traveler.
Okay. I've heard of this game. Describe it.
Traveler is the story of basically very Firefly-esque, though it predates Firefly by a good ways.
Oh, yeah.
Usually about people who are hyperspace traveling merchants, the crew of a ship that, as they try and make money and keep their ship in the sky, get into space adventures.
Okay. So what is the play loop for Traveler? Past character creation? Because isn't Traveler the kind of game where character creation can like kill your character?
You can't really do that in the new edition. You can't have your character wind up, I think, being like in their 60s or 70s, but like they don't just die taking risky roles on character creation anymore.
Explain this.
There's a life path system where you try to get into certain education or certain jobs and you have to make a role, and it's got this whole, your previous experiences shape what skill packages you have, and your character didn't get to do everything they wanted because they failed roles during this character creation system. I actually think it's pretty neat. I would not want to homebrew it from scratch for another system, but I think it's a pretty neat, like, sort of life path system. So you wind up with a character, like a story outline for where you've been, baked into your character from the session zero, which is a cool idea. And it's one that's been in this game, I think, like from the beginning back in the 80s, which is neat.
I would say that role-playing games don't have genre. They have IP. Like when you play a role-playing game, you're playing an IP. You're not playing genre. To me, it's all fantasy. Have I ever told you why I don't like time travel in movies and most TV shows?
We've talked about how we like Looper, but I can't remember.
Okay, I'll use Looper as the example. Okay, a friend of mine pointed this out to me. All right, time travel is actually an extremely complicated idea. And somehow this very complicated idea got simplified into a story mechanism that then is being transmitted to a general audience because the people who make the movie don't know how much familiarity you or I may have with time travel. So it's simplified, it's boiled down, it's Back to the Future or whatever, right? And so the uphill battle of time travel as entertainment for me is that you have to take this exceptionally complicated idea, boil it down to one or two, maybe three base elements, and then try to communicate that to an audience where you have no idea what their familiarity level is with your concept. And you have to have Bruce Willis, the guy from Die Hard, you know, like I got a machine gun, you know, that guy is going to explain fucking time travel to an audience of people who may or may not have a college education or life experience, or may not have read any books theoretical about time travel or how it works. Like time travel is not, to me, it's not really done as anywhere close to what it deserves. And it ends up just being lazy storytelling, in my opinion. And I'm not trying to be harsh and critical about role-playing games, but that's how I look at role-playing games. So instead of time travel, it's all fantasy. Like Cyberpunk as a role-playing game is not a science fiction role-playing game. It's a fantasy role-playing game where the magic is flavored differently. You know, I have yet to play an actual science fiction role-playing game because for me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, please do. But for me, science fiction is there has to be a scientific element, a true scientific element in the science fiction to anchor it to reality. So we're thinking old school Star Trek in the sense of like the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, where they were taking science concepts and then creating fiction out of them. And the modern version of science fiction, especially in Star Trek, and I'm going to the Chris Pine Star Trek, where they're like, oh, there's a Romulan spaceship, there's a lightning storm in space. Really? A lightning storm in space? That's the best you can do for me, Star Trek? So at some point, science fiction just becomes fantasy. So until somebody says to me, hey, here's a role-playing game that uses actual science fiction, which I think would be next to impossible to do, because who is at your table? I barely graduated high school. Okay. I am, if you look up straight white male privilege in the encyclopedia, you're going to see my face. Okay. Like I'm not a smart person. I barely understand how to do anything. Okay. I'm not a big thinker when it comes to science fiction or science concepts. And you're going to run a science fiction role-playing game and you're going to what? Do the Bruce Willis thing at the table in Looper where he's like putting the straws out and he's like, I don't have enough time to explain time travel to you. Here's some straws.
No.
Rebuttal.
All right. I'm gonna need to call in some people and get one of those big trampolines below the buildings before I try and talk you off this ledge.
Yeah, talk me off.
Okay. So when it comes to genre in an RPG, I hate this description, but there is a section. There are basically tropes that are identifiable with the genre that are a part and parcel. And I get what you're saying about the lightning storm in space being something more akin to fantasy or space opera. And that's the thing that's interesting about the Abrams Star Trek movies is they made Star Trek a space opera, and Star Trek was never a space opera before.
Yes.
I don't know that I would say that Star Trek was hard sci-fi in any way, shape, or form, but it was more about the ideas of utopia and basically it explores different eras of its time. I mean, Strange New World kind of does the same thing these days for me. And Aid Edmondson has amazing hair, and I just God, he's a pretty man. So anyway, Yeah, I think putting those tropes in. Do I want Cyberpunk has the tropes of the loss of autonomy and the corporatization of everything and a maybe fruitless and futile struggle and a hyper capitalism where you have to give up, everything to have some kind of edge, but you're still struggling to try and get, ahead. Those are all to me elements of cyberpunk. And I think you can have a cyberpunk game where those are the themes inherent in your game. It's not necessarily fantasy. Are they all fantastic? Are they all things of the imagination? Yes, but are they fantasy with dwarves and magic and dragons? No, that's a set of tropes that's associated with fantasy. And again, they're sliders. One of the things that I really like about modern story games is I find that they tend to do genre fiction very well by baking into the mechanics those tropes, those things you expect to see. So if I had to say right now, what do I play most? Fantasy. What do I play second most? Sci-fi. What's my third? Cyberpunk. And about there is where my play experience kind of stops. I did get to do a Star Trek Adventures with a dude who is real into sci-fi, what is the nature of thought, what it means to be human. And it was a really cool experience to see what happened in that game with all the science aspects and that dude has a deep knowledge of canon. And I know you're listening, Mark. I love you. I love you so much. So yeah. And then I'm now playing in a Dune game, which is not sci-fi. Dune is not sci-fi. The books are, but like the RPG, it is a cool, weird fantasy that has some cyberpunk or some fantasy or sci-fi elements. When I think of other genres that are kind of in the mainstream of games out there that I haven't done and maybe want to do, Western.
Okay.
And yes, you could do a fantasy story or use D&D rules to tell a Western story, but I haven't participated in a Western story. Pulp adventure. I don't know. Is Takara pulp adventure because we're doing the pirate thing? It doesn't feel like, like a standard
Takara
fantasy.
is swashbuckling fantasy.
Yeah. Okay. So different subgenre. So yeah, Westerns out there. Weird West is a subgenre of Western that is very popular in the RPG space. Weird World War is another one.
Mm-hmm.
Barely ever get to play horror games, which is a whole different. I would like to.
So what kind of themes are we exploring in your typical fantasy role-playing game that makes it fantasy? If you were to take out dwarves and elves and dragons and orcs, what makes a fantasy game a fantasy game?
I don't think if you take those things out, you have a fantasy game anymore.
I disagree. I think you do. I think fantasy is about fantasy is 0 to hero. It's prophecy. It's epic, larger than life, circumstances, kingdoms, gods, events, armies. It's about making your character the center of the universe. That's what fantasy is to me. That's what fantasy storytelling is. As far as a role-playing game, you are making the player characters feel like the center of the universe. There is these amazing world or universe altering things that are happening around them, and they are the prophesized few that are going to be participating in these world-changing events. Now, not every D&D game starts with, you are the prophesized warriors of light, and each of you has a crystal you are wearing around your neck.
Sometimes it does, though.
Not all of our D&D games start that way, but those are the basic elements. It's a power fantasy. It is taking characters that were nothing or were very little or were just exceptional and making them a lot of progression for fantasy games involves gods, demons, interdimensional aliens. Like you just keep increasing the power level as you go up. And I don't see that in the, like when I play Shadowrun, that's not what's happening.
Yeah, you're not the hero in Shadowrun. Like,
right. You're just doing jobs and getting mixed up in crazy shit. You know what I mean? So I think you could still do fantasy role play without magic, without swords, without orcs. You know, one of the things I love most about Star Wars is that it's not science fiction; it's science fantasy. You
yeah,
know, or space opera, or whatever we're calling it, right? That's what I love about it. I love fantasy. You know, so what are the important themes that need to be explored in a science fiction game? Like in a cyberpunk game, you're exploring transhumanism. Like, what does it mean to be you when you're able to replace, alter, improve different aspects of yourself? You know, I was listening to the Core podcast, which is about video games. The hosts were talking about the latest cyberpunk video game, and they were talking about a romance segment in the game where you and this other character are having sex in a tank, and then you hack into the tank and you trade sensations so that she's having the male orgasm and you're having the female orgasm. And for a split second, I was like, wouldn't it be cool if a science fiction role playing game at the table let you do shit like that? And I'm not saying like fuck your friends and exchange orgasms. What I mean is, I would love to play in a role playing game that explores transhumanism like that, that explores that aspect.
I have news for you.
Do tell.
There is one.
Mm-hmm.
Of course there is. Yeah, it's called Eclipse Phase. And
okay, what's the play loop?
The play loop is the general campaign is basically you. I can't remember the name. It's been a minute since I read the book. You work for humanity almost got wiped out in the what do they call it? The big event, the singularity.
Mm-hmm.
The singularity happened. It triggered some AI kill everybody robots that were left beyond the orbit of Saturn or something by some ancient elder intelligence, came down, turned Earth into dust. The only people that were left were the people in the off-world colonies or in Mars space stations. A couple people, like a bunch of people, they call it ego casting. Everybody, like Altered Carbon, everybody has a cortical stack that backs up your personality, and you can ego cast your personality into another cortical stack. So masses of refugees ego cast off Earth before the transmissions were cut, but none of them have bodies. So some companies now, with what's left of humanity, have been like, hey, we can put you in a body. Like, we can't run a computer simulation for your mind, so you're on storage, but we'll wake you up for a second. We'll make you a deal. We'll put you in a body, but you're going to be an indentured servant for like 20 years to work off your debt to us for giving you a body. Gotcha. But you can have you can be an uplifted octopus that walks around in the body of a tank. You can shift bodies all the time. The tagline's great. It's like the body is software, hack it. Death is a bug, overcome it, or something like that. And the core play loop is you work for like a quasi secret organization that looks into and deals with extinction level threats like the AI that made Earth fall, because Earth is totally fallen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this sounds intriguing. I would like to play this game.
I made a character for it once for a game my buddy George was going to do, who was like basically like at some point before Earth fell, they reverse engineered the genome for Neanderthals and like uplifted them. I don't know if that would have been necessary, but like, so he was basically a Neanderthal that lived on Mars. And his name was Chert Bear. And he just roamed around in his rover, like doing geology on Mars and like napping flint spears and stuff with monomolecular edges. I thought it was a neat concept. And then he'd, go off and do missions for this organization, would have been the play loop.
Well, what are the missions then?
I think one of the starting adventures is like you have like a backup. You ego cast a backup. So if you die, no trubs, like just slot your last backup into a new body. But like one of the starting adventures is like a mystery where like you died and there have been 7 days since your last backup. So you lost 7 days and it's it's a mystery to uncover what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, that's pretty neat. That's a cool idea for a story.
Do you think the average group of people playing at a tabletop role playing game are going to be able to handle that game?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think people will surprise you.
Look, I definitely know that people will surprise me. I also know that people like to drink, make jokes, and have fun.
Yeah.
So that's more akin to my role playing game experience. Is like we're just we're gonna have some fun and make jokes and do goof 'em ups, and that's okay. That's what role playing game is. That's the style of the storytelling. Like I don't know what would happen if I was in a role playing game where we were doing fucking Van Damme serious bullshit all the time. You know. So what is the play loop then for another genre? Like what other genres are we talking about? So there's like a top secret SI style game, like a spy game.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Western. What is the equivalent in the Western to what we just talked about? Like what makes a Western truly a Western? Is it exploration? Is it survival? Is it gunfights? Like what makes a Western truly unique in a role-playing game setting that's not replicated in fantasy or science fiction or a different, because you mentioned making things weird in a lot of circumstance. And I think that is the default cop out of role-playing games is like, well, it's like a Western, but it's weird. It's like, well, why can't it just be a Western? Because that's not how role-playing games work. Role-playing games need to have the fantasy element, and making it weird adds the fantasy element. That's what cues the players and the DM or the GM into, that this hobby really only has one genre, which is fantasy.
All right, boys, bring that thing back over here. We're going to need it.
I do recognize that this is my failing before people pull out the pitchfork shaped emails. This is my failing. It's my responsibility to seek out games and groups that can do genre and different kinds of games. But I will also caveat that with I've been doing this for a long time. The majority of it's fantasy and D&D, and I've played in a lot of groups. Okay. So what's the Western play loop? What are the themes that make it a uniquely Western game without magic, making it weird, any of that other shit?
I think it's the temptation towards might makes right. And I hate to think about it in these terms because there's so much of that genre wrapped up with colonial oppression, especially as how we see it in the United States. But it's like the veneer of civilization breaking down, the temptation of leaning towards might makes right. There's the struggle for survival.
The lawless.
There's the veneer of law, but it is actually lawless, and
Yeah. If I was going to run a Western game, the lethality of this game would be very sharp. Like in Dungeons and Dragons, we have hit point totals and cast X number of spells or attacks, and they do these kinds of damage. And then when you're at 0, you're dead, or whatever the case may be. If I was running a Western game, it would have to be mandatory that you could get smoked like that. Just like, somebody has a gun, you're dead. Like, if you're going to go out and do a shootout, you got one chance to make this work. Like, you know what I mean? So I think that would be, if somebody said to me, ask me the question, I would say lethality needs to be an omnipresent, overhanging thematic aspect of a Western role-playing game.
Yeah. Sudden, excessive, the ever-present possibility of sudden, excessive violence with a high level of lethality is the thing about that. I mean, or you could, Like the weird, like, oh, there's like, a zombie train. I mean, I actually don't. I've never really played a Western game, and I haven't read a lot of Western game books. I mean, the story game I go to, I've only heard tales of because it's like super out of print, and that's Dogs in the Vineyard.
Hmm.
And that one is all about your moral choices.
Explain
Because
Dogs in the Vineyard.
if you haven't heard of that, and this is me having glanced at the book once years ago, I don't own it, I haven't played it, but my understanding is you are basically Mormon paladins.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Gunslinging Mormon paladins that travel from community to community, solving problems,
Mm-hmm.
either with mercy or with steel. um, and the game heavily revolves around the moral choices you make about what is the law you will enforce as someone looked to in these communities as a keeper of law.
Yeah. I would put Westerns and revenge movies in the same bucket as far as if trying to put that in a role-playing game experience. I think those two ideas have a lot in common with each other, and that is the way that I would run a Western game. Is your characters are the people that are willing to do things that other people aren't because reasons. And you know the the Jekyll boys have kidnapped so and so's daughter. Nobody else will go take them on and try to get her back.
Yep.
That's the Western game.
And in the Western game, you could be doing that because it's right and you're the law, or you could be doing it for money. And those people are going to work together because there's only the thinnest veneer of quote unquote civilization.
These would be the character classes in a Western game for me. I'm really glad you just said that. Like there'd be a temptation for the character classes to be like Card Shark or Gunslinger or whatever. You know what I mean?
And that's what Deadlands does, but that's Weird West.
Yeah. The classes for my Western game would be exactly what you just said. Like the do-gooder, the, mercenary, the character that just wants to hurt other people. Like these are your character classes. Like we're just all gunfighters or card sharks or whatever. That's a different part of character creation. The classes are your motivation in this world. You do the things that you do because you love to hurt people. That's your character class. And that's what, like, that informs you about the world and the play experience. You know what I mean? Like I've often tried to figure out what kind of game would be perfect for the quote unquote murder hobo style group. And, we did an episode about this before about altering your game to fit that play style. And I think a Western game, high lethality with those kind of options would be perfect.
Yep. I think one of the things too going into it is we talked about that a while ago in an episode about that expectation of the long campaign in fantasy games. I don't think anybody goes into a Western game thinking this is going to be a long campaign.
Yeah.
Because like either your character's going to die, or in 5 years the territory is going to become a state and the law will come in and there'll be government, and then you're fucked. And you gotta, hopefully there's another place in the frontier where you won't get killed by whoever's there, and you can
Yeah, I would do the game sessions like they were movies taking place over with huge swaths of time in between.
I got to thinking about this topic actually because I watched a Western, and I was like, I want to steal elements of this for another game. And it got me thinking about, what if you did Dark Sun as a Western?
Fuck yeah, dude.
So the movie's I think 2017. It's called Bone Tomahawk.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen it?
Yes.
I
have.
I had no idea this thing existed. And one of the weird rabbit holes I'm on in TikTok is just like, here's 2 minutes from the middle of some random movie because we know you'll watch it. Like, what the hell is this? And it was Bone Tomahawk. And I was like, intrigued. So I found it was on Tubi. And I watched it and I was like, my God, this is a great this is a great adventure for a role-playing game, like a Death Spiral one. But I was like, you could literally just that whole like freed slave tribe from the Dark Sun game, like that is Hope Springs. And there's some Gith that are living out in the cave, and some wandering merchant wanders through their. I mean, you could literally take the story beats, and yeah.
Bone Tomahawk is the kind of movie that got explained to me before I watched it, and it did not prepare me for what happened next.
I was
it's intense.
You know what I was thinking of for my explanation? If you hadn't seen it, I was like, okay, imagine this. It's the 13th Warrior.
A movie I like.
But it's a Western and a horror movie.
Yeah, that's perfect.
And there are some things, I know it's a modern Western, so there's some really interesting things they did, like the character of the professor, who is a Native American who comes in and has to, like, one of the characters is very obviously a bigot, and the other guy is Kurt Russell is calling him out for it. Like,
yeah, that was like in the middle of a Russell Sans, a Kurt Russell Sans, where he was like in everything all of a sudden, and you're like, oh shit, he's making a comeback, and then he was like, nah.
I'm just making some cool movies that go with my mustache.
Yeah.
I'm fine with that.
I took the time to grow this, so now we're going to make some movies.
He does have the mustache in Bone Tomahawk, by the way. Faithful listeners. But yeah, that movie is crazy intense. And I love the character of Chicory. I was just like, I feel like I just learned so much about dialogue watching this.
Yeah, that would make a great Dark Sun game. If you do it, I will keep my mouth shut about it.
Okay.
Because I want to play in that game.
Yeah, that's the lethality, though. It goes perfectly with Dark Sun.
Yeah.
Except get rid of the veneer of civilization part.
Yeah. It's just as grittier.
Yeah. So that got me thinking, is Sword and Sorcery a Western?
I was about to say that. I didn't want to interrupt, the explanation of Bone Tomahawk, but that popped into my head as well. Does Sword and Sorcery fall into the Western category?
Yep.
And, Sword and Sorcery tends not to have like a prophecy, or at least a true prophecy, or at least a world altering prophecy. Like in Sword and Sorcery, it all really affects the character in that moment. You know what I mean? They are not changing the world or existence. Conan may become like a great warlord, but it's not like he's going to take over the entire earth. And you know what I mean? Or maybe I'm wrong and I'm thinking about something else. I don't know. You're nodding your head though.
Yeah. I heard a thing interesting for if you're a listener in Oklahoma. I highly recommend you check out DM Dave's in Norman, Oklahoma. It has the best selection of role-playing game books in the state. It's really, and the guy who runs it, DM Dave, is super cool. And I was talking to him about Dark Sun. And check out his Patreon, his blog. He's got a bunch of stuff on DM's Guild. He's a super cool dude. Throw some money at him. He writes good books. But I was talking to him, it's just like, yeah, for Sword and Sorcery, you need 3 character classes: Fighter, Barbarian, and Rogue. And that's like, that's a Sword and Sorcery game. And what you said about characters, like the do-gooder, the opportunist, and the bastard.
Yep. Thank you. You just named him. Yep.
Are we writing a Western game?
I think we are, with scarcity dice and a location-based magic system that everybody can access.
Yes. So now it's Weird West. That's okay.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, what about romance, Jesse? Let's make this the last one we explore. I've never played in a romance game. I don't even know if I fully understand exactly what a romance game is.
Are there romance games?
in the Cipher System book, they have a little bit of a section dedicated to how to use the Cipher System in a romance style game. So I can only assume.
Well, what did that say?
Well, it uses the Cipher System rules and then modifies them and adds a few other elements to build upon relationships as a core mechanic of the gameplay experience. You know, I feel like romance is this, thing we pigeonhole into role-playing games, that it's a thing that exists. Like, what about the the Legend of the Four Rings or whatever it is?
L5R, Legend of the Five Rings?
That's what it is. Yeah. Is that a romance game?
No, that's the main campaign, like the default campaign is you may be of different clans, but you're all magistrates serving the imperial throne, wandering the roads of the empire, solving crimes. Like, samurai movies. It's a samurai movie.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I feel like you've explained this to me before in another episode. So if I forget this a third time, everybody drink. But what are the key elements of a romance game? Like, if we're questioning the viability of its existence, then maybe we can disprove it right now.
I don't know, because I like have zero. Okay. Closest thing I would say to playing a game that I would say was maybe a romance game is The Good Society.
Okay.
Did I tell you about The Good Society, or have you heard of The Good Society?
I've never heard of it.
The Good Society is a Regency era role-playing game designed to emulate the fiction of, Jane Austen, basically. And so you have like these people in their summer houses, you make characters, and there is no fighting. Mm-hmm. There's just the opportunity for scandal, and you can do romance if you want. We were trying to do a romance arc. I was like, I'm okay. We're doing this. I'm going to try and do a romance arc, very a Pride and Prejudice thing. I think I did okay. At one point, Carrie said my character brought that big D energy. D is for Darcy, for Mr. Darcy. Yeah, I was trying to romance my wife's character because that was about as comfortable as I felt, even role-playing romantic overtures. So I know that I want to say an Apocalypse World game called Pasión de las Pasiones, which is designed to do Mexican telenovelas. Mm-hmm. I know that the whole strings relationship systems in Monster Hearts could let you do romance, but I feel like this is an area where I would need to develop some maturity as a gamer, because I have been tainted by my previous experience with D&D, where romance means seduction. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's what a good romance game would be about. Not to say it wouldn't happen, but it wouldn't be like all you do.
Yeah, I think you could play a romance game without any intimate or sexual aspects to it whatsoever. When somebody says romance game to me, it's about relationships and relationship building. So your courtly intrigue game, you could make a game that takes place in a king or queen's court. Every session involves political intrigue.
A Court of Blades by Two Drakes. It's Forged in the Dark.
Oh, okay.
It is that game. I have it.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. That's what stands out to me as a romance game, is you have to manipulate people or honor personal connections or whatever the case may be. And that's what the whole game experience should be about. But I still don't know if it actually, I don't think I've ever actually played in this game.
Yeah, because one of the things that I think that maybe we don't do well, and it might be a fun secret experiment for us in games we play, we might be working up to this with Thaddeus and Berdine. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I think would make a romance game work is the whole idea of delayed gratification. And I don't mean sexual gratification. I mean achieving your heart's desires, right? Having that be delayed, and the tension of, delaying that is what would make the story interesting from a romance perspective. And as people who grew up on power fantasy D&D, I feel like fundamentally delayed gratification in a role-playing game is not a thing I personally am super great at.
Well said. I agree with you. I'm the same way. Okay. What if you did a game where you're playing like 2 or 3 characters? You're like, let's say the game is your house, whatever, House Black Talon, and then you have 3 characters that you have to create for this house, this noble house. The first character will be in court. The second character will be the gets their hands dirty character, the do-gooder, the opportunist, the bastard, right? And then there's a third play loop, and each one of these uses the genre element. So some of the game sessions take place in the court, and then in order to influence the things that go on in court, those characters turn to their mercenaries or their bodyguards or their hired thugs and say, go break that guy's legs, or whatever the case may be. Like, I need this vote to go badly, so I need you to scare the shit out of the senator. And then you go to the next scene and you're playing your do-gooder, opportunist, or bastard. And there's a high lethality involved in that play loop. So the style of the game takes place in these pods, you know what I mean? And they revolve around most of the things that we talked about. I'm trying to work in a transhuman aspect as well. It's not working. I didn't get there. But do you see what I'm saying?
Future space courts. Same system, but you've got 3 personalities and 1 body.
This is why I love you.
You switch the personality, and bonus round, much like the Shadow in Wraith the Oblivion, when you have to use the bastard, someone else at the table gets to play you.
Uh-huh. I love it. I love it.
But they have your face, and everybody's going to think it was you. So, but the bastard is played by another character at the table, representing your darkest impulses, the shard of your personality you had cut away so you could be a good person. But sometimes there's some work you have to do for your space noble house that you got to let the bastard out. And when that happens, another player at the table plays your character.
I love it. I love it.
And then you have to deal with the consequences of that as the do-gooder or the mercenary.
Oh my God, you're beautiful.
We're beautiful, my friend.
If you ever want Jesse to come over and fix your life for you, you can write into the Jaunty Mantis. Jesse, what's our email address?
It's jauntymantis@gmail.com.
Or you could contact us on Threads.
I haven't opened that in like 6 weeks.
The system works, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, I'm at Jingoist Fact on X. I will get a notification if you send it. I don't expect anything to come in that way. We have one, but yeah, we didn't build it. Don't bother with Jaunty Mantis at Jaunty Mantis. Who cares?
Yeah. Well, if you have any questions, comments about genre, about different types of stories and different types of games, maybe you know the perfect game. Maybe you know that I am wrong and you are going to tell me. I would love to hear it from you, but only if you can keep it short and brief and concise.
Right. As long as you want, we're grateful for the engagement.
No, I'm going to cut it down. All right.
Doesn't even have access to the email inbox. Make it as long as you want.
I edit this program. All right. So I have full power over keeping this brief. You could
Damn
read
it, I win it again.
you could read an email for an hour on this podcast, and I would cut it down to 12 seconds.
Hold on, I'm booting up the bastard.
Well, until we start our offshoot podcast called Booting Up the Bastard, I've been Matty.
And I've been Jesse.
And get out there and play some fucking role-playing games and shit.
Play some fucking games, I guess. Or, don't.